Hello and welcome to this online lecture on 1920s America. Okay, we have reached the 100-year anniversary of this decade that we call the 1920s, probably the decade in American history that resembles the modern world, the present day America, more so than any decade or period that we've examined so far. The 1920s kind of seems familiar to us, you know. I guess it's a period where we probably could have coped living in if we were fortunate enough to be able to experience some of the more comfortable aspects of 1920s living. So in this kind of class, we're going to actually look at technically two topics, even though in my city they are separated between the 1920s online book and the Great Depression book. It's difficult to completely separate these two topics because what happens in the 1920s will eventually be crucial to the causes of the Great Depression. The causes of the Great Depression emerge in the 1920s because the Wall Street crash occurs in 1929, and the crash is also the kind of event that leads to the depression, but the actual long-term structural causes of the depression can be traced back even to World War One. So we are going to kind of look at these two topics in conjunction, but today we're mainly focusing on the 1920s, and I might now and again flag up some examples that are relevant to our next topic, which is the Great Depression, and also the causes of the Great Depression are going to be a big part of that. Okay, before we look at the different elements of the 1920s, the different kind of factors, different categories such as technological change and politics and culture and social issues. Before we get to all of these things, I just very quickly want to talk about the electoral process during the 1920s. There are three elections in 1920, 24 and 28. These elections are all won by Republicans, really with the exception of that 8-year period when Woodrow Wilson was in power from 1912 to 1920. We are looking at a 40-year period of Republican Party dominance that can be traced back as far as 1892. It doesn't end until 1932 when Roosevelt comes in, and then you get a period of Democratic dominance. So you've got this kind of little hiatus with Wilson in the middle, and Wilson only really wins that election because the Republican Party is split between Taft and Roosevelt. That's Theodore Roosevelt. So the 20s is really a continuation of Republican success, and here you can see that the new president of the United States in 1920 is Warren Harding, who wins the electoral vote in an incredibly convincing manner. In 1924, Harding is replaced by Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge wins here again the electoral college vote fairly easily. We've got one other political party, if you like, or movement. Robert M. La Follette represents the progressive movement, who make a little bit of a comeback, but don't do particularly well. Wisconsin is La Follette's own state. And then 1928, Herbert Hoover, who will go down in history as not being one of America's most successful presidents because of the Great Depression, but he wins the 1928 election with great ease. Look at the amount of red on the map for the Republican Party, and the electoral college vote is a 444 to 87 victory. So a massive success. The Democrats, the Catholic Democrat, the first Catholic presidential nomination, the Catholic Al Smith, just picks up these kind of small amount of states in the South, which is in some respects bizarre because these are the areas where there was the rebirth of the Klan in the 1920s. So the Klan obviously exported across large parts of America, and the Klan was incredibly anti-Catholic at this point. So there's a bit of a contradiction here in terms of the way that American politics is kind of playing out. The 1920s is a rather complex period politically, as we will see. So Republicans. It's a decade, therefore, where you're going to get pro-business economic policies. Okay, let's just focus in on the kind of context. Okay, so the period that we're about to look at, the 1920s, is often referred to as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, and these names have been given to the 1920s, partly because of how the decade has been perceived or has been popularised in popular culture, whether that be within movies or within TV programmes, documentaries, books, whatever it is. The 1920s has been characterised in a way that has been rather appealing to the American people and the American public. A lot of books were actually written themselves in the 1920s that give us quite a useful kind of set of kind of primary sources, even if these primary sources are fictional, where we get a real sense of what life was like. And in more recent times, the most famous book of this period, The Great Gatsby, has been made into a feature film, and I guess that film portrayed the 1920s in a rather positive but slightly decadent period. Source 1, I'm just going to quickly flick to this source, you can see it here. This is an article from a journal, and it's a useful little introduction here where I've wrote source 1, because although this article is primarily about the origins of radio in the USA, which is something we'll talk about in a moment, the article also gives us a little kind of brief summary of how the 1920s has been characterised. So it begins by saying the 1920s has long held a special place in the history of the USA, conjuring vivid images of flappers dancing the Charleston, bootleggers and gangsters skirting the prohibition laws, and the carefree post-war socialites of F. Scott Fitzgerald novels. The Great Gatsby. As with many evocative eras in history, the 1920s has given many titles which seek to capture and convey its very nature. And these are the ones I just mentioned: the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and so on. And the 20s is an interesting period because where it sits in history, it arrives immediately after the kind of challenges of World War One, and it ends, and what follows it is this kind of prolonged economic hardship for the American people. So the 1920s feels like a kind of relief for the American population. They didn't know that at the time, right? They did not know that what was around the corner was the Great Depression. So the 1920s is an interesting time. Some of the points that were raised in that source 1 are the kind of type of almost kind of stereotypes that we have of this period. But as much as there are stereotypes, that there is a reality within these groups. So there's these kind of, this is to quote the historian T.H. Watkins, there are these flappers and lounge lizards, and there was bootleg gin, and there was, to quote Watkins, backseat sin, so this is something I'll come to later on, and there were gangsters, and there were gamblers, and there were movie stars, and there were socialites. There were all of these things, all of these groups, who appear to maybe express the kind of popular, positive aspects of 1920s life, but there were also religious fundamentalists, Klansmen, unfettered capitalism took hold during this period. Prohibition is a bizarre outcome of the post-World War I period that lands in the 1920s. For all of the excitement and enjoyment of the 1920s that we associate with speakeasies and dance halls, the 1920s is the period where Americans were told not to drink, not to enjoy themselves too much. So we've got this conflict of cultures. An America that on the one hand accepts what we call the Volstead Act, the act to ban the sale of alcohol, and this other culture, the kind of urban culture, the new emerging cities, where during the 1920s nobody wants to obey this law, nobody wants to stop enjoying themselves. And that's something we have to bear in mind when we think about the 1920s. America, and this is the case with every decade, America has disparate groups that will benefit and will enjoy participating in this this era, and those who will have a very different take on the kind of frivolity of the 1920s, that is mostly the rural parts of the country and small towns who do obey the prohibition laws. Now, in terms of the overall political climate, as I mentioned earlier, the president is Warren G. Harding, and Harding comes to office on a ticket of a return to normalcy, right, or a return to normality. I just want to very quickly quote Harding in his attempts to become president. He stated the following: "America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not surgery but serenity." And what Harding was really trying to say here was, after years of the Industrial Revolution, industrialisation, class conflict, World War One, foreign policy adventures that we've spoke about regarding American imperialist adventures, all of that for Harding had to maybe come to an end. America just needed stability, calmness, and maybe even a return to some of the kind of traditional values. It shows you that Harding is also kind of stuck in between these cultures, these conflicting cultures. He wants America to go down one particular route, i.e. this normal, good old-fashioned American way of life, but at the same time he's presiding over America that is changing, and is changing dramatically. And the pro-business culture that we associate with Harding and then his successor Calvin Coolidge, this pro-business culture will actually result in America becoming more technologically advanced and more urban and in its outlook, and that old world, this old normal world, actually starts to disappear during Harding's time in office, as well as Coolidge's time, right up until the Great Depression. Now, very quickly, we are going to come back to this bullet point, but I just want to mention this. The 1920s, the characterisation of the 1920s is an easy one for popular culture to focus on, but we should remember that, 1920s, a lot is going on, and there are real issues regarding race. In the 1920s, we see a serious amount of lynchings, as we mentioned in the previous discussion of Jim Crow America. There are not just serious kind of race relations and inequalities for African Americans. There are also labour relations at an all-time low as we enter the 1920s. This is illustrated in the Zinn chapter 15, where there is a discussion of the Seattle strike of 1919. It's worth reading this chapter for a kind of slightly different take on the 1920s. I'm going to actually quote not Zinn but another historian, Maldwin Jones, who gives us a little kind of summary of where labour relations stood as we reached the 1920s, and why maybe there was this desire for the so-called return to normalcy. Jones says the disturbed emotional legacy of the First World War was manifested in the Red Scare of 1919, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the formation of the Third International, that's the kind of communist movement, international communist movement, aroused fears of a new alien menace and kept alive the narrow coercive nationalism of wartime America. Xenophobia was no longer directed against alleged German sympathisers, as was the case during World War I, but against alien radicals and revolutionaries. Many Americans were alarmed at the pro-Soviet leanings of a militant faction in the American Socialist Party and the emergence of this new American Communist Party, which had a largely foreign membership. An accompanying wave of industrial unrest was widely, though wrongly, interpreted as revolutionary. After Seattle had been paralysed by a 5-day general strike in February of 1919, and that's what Zinn talks about, there came other violent strikes in industries such as textiles, railroads, and a massive strike in the steel industry. Public opinion became strongly anti-trade union, especially after the Boston police strike of September 19. Fear of revolution increased when homemade bombs were posted to prominent politicians and industrialists, and explosions occurred simultaneously in 8 different cities. So the pre-1920 Labour relations are at a kind of all-time low, and we kind of see that the kind of working class galvanised by maybe some of the success that they had had during World War One and the period up to this point. There is, in the 1920s, as the last point of that quote from George said, a bit of a backlash against the unions and the labour movement, and the labour movement does kind of go into disarray. The 1920s, we will see a decline in trade union membership, and it's worth remembering that because that could be a key factor in explaining why we have one particular cause of the Great Depression in our next lesson. Okay, that's enough on context. Let's look at some of the key examples of life in the United States during the 1920s, and the first place we're going to start off with is changes in consumption. Now, when I say changes in consumption, I really just mean the beginnings of consumer society. We often talk about the world that we live in right now being consumer society, and this is a kind of new creation. Well, it's not really a new creation because it begins in the 1920s. I just want to focus on these two little tables where it says source 2, and there are examples of what maybe a regular American family may have had to purchase in 1900 compared to 1928. The 1900 family may have spent some of their earnings on bicycles, brushes, brooms, maybe if they're lucky, a sewing machine, wringer, washboard, right? All these kind of traditional items. Compare that to 1928. This is a very short period of time, right? In the grand scale of things, this is people who were alive in 1900 are still alive in 1928, and they are still consuming in 1928. Their lives have changed dramatically, as you can see. So the major thing that we're going to talk about in a moment is the automobile. That's a rather large annual outgoing. Obviously, you don't have to spend that every year. But the radio, phonograph, washing machine, vacuum cleaner, sewing machine, other electrical equipment, telephone, all of these things are now available to the American consumer. Wages do go up, right? Real wages do go up during this period. Now, does that mean that inequality disappears? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that the standard of living improves? Well, it does to an extent. However, wages go up, but the amount of things, consumer products, available to buy also goes up. So it doesn't mean that people are going to have more money in their pocket. They are going to feel kind of forced or compelled to buy some of these things that are now available. And a big part of this story that we're going to get to in a moment, a big part of the story of the 1920s is the story of debt. Now, before we get to this kind of negative aspect of the 1920s, let's focus on the positive consumer patterns that start to emerge. I want to start with a very short story about Edward Filene. Maybe not the most well-known Americans. He was a Boston department store owner. He truly believed that mass production was about to create a world of abundance for all, not just the wealthy, in which trouble-free prosperity would ensure freedom and peace, not just in America, but around the world. He felt that if people could consume, people would be happy. If people were happy, and he's talking about nations being happy, then there would be less likelihood of kind of conflict domestically and eventually in foreign fields as well. He believed that if you improve the conditions of your workers, if you give them unemployment insurance, if you give them medical insurance, if you improve the environment they live in, and Filene did spend a lot of money trying to improve the city of Boston. If you gave your workers higher wages, they would then spend these wages, and they would spend them in shops like Filene. So more consumption would be good for the businessman, more consumption would be good for the department store owner. If you lower the prices of the goods in your shops and you increase the wages, then people are going to buy even more things. Now, except we live in a world now where consuming for the sake of consuming has potentially disastrous environmental issues. That was obviously not part of the thought process in the 1920s. Now, there is obviously maybe some concern amongst industrialists, businessmen, shop owners. If you increase wages and lower prices, then you are lowering profits. and that's not how the capitalist system works. So Fellaini is not acting like a typical capitalist. He is he's kind of innovating, I guess you could say, and he is maybe, if other people had acted like Fellaini, maybe America would have been slightly more equal society, and the depression probably could have been averted if there were more people like Fellaini who believed that it was a price worth paying, less profits for a more happier, not just workforce, but a happier America in general. And Fellaini, maybe this sums up his naivety, stated, once abundance had been achieved, minds, so the minds of ordinary Americans, will inevitably turn to higher issues, culture, art, etc. He's a bit of a lone wolf, Fellaini. So what actually does underpin more consumption, mass consumption, is not the ideals of Fellaini, but actually advertising and marketing, and there's a crazy amount of money spent on these things, and in fact there's a little example down there where it says that the automobile industry in 1929 alone spent $10 million on advertising. So this is a big part of the 1920s way of encouraging people to buy and consume, and we'll look at some of the methods used by these savvy advertising men. And then the second aspect of the main reason maybe even why the 1920s is able to be called this consumer period is because credit, cheap credit, is made available to the American people. So it's a good time for big business. There's low taxes, there's tariffs in place to protect American industries, there's a decline in trade union membership, business thrives, and this so-called positive business climate leads to all of these technological developments which are very useful for Americans. This is definitely an example of progress under this capitalist system. These things would include the radiator, the refrigerator, the washing machine, all these things that were mentioned. Radio, right, which is a really crucial part of American life, really, from the 1920s onwards. This probably falls more into the kind of cultural sphere rather than the technological kind of category, because although radio obviously was a new invention, it's the impact that it has on people's lives, and that's what you can touch on in source 3. It transforms people's lives. People now become connected with other parts of America. There are national shows, national advertising takes place on radio. It's a place in the home now where the radio can be the focal point of the home, where people can sit around and listen to the programmes that were being presented. And when news was on the radio, it leads to a more educated America as well. So technological developments in this climate, this pro-business climate, is I would say a really successful aspect of 1920s America. We also see changes in production. At the very bottom I've noted here that these changes in production, the assembly line methods of producing technological items, this is much more productive, much quicker form of producing goods, where men, sometimes women, would work on this assembly line just doing the same job day in, day out, but that small job is part of a bigger process, and that bigger process created things like the automobile much more quickly and efficiently and cheaply, and this eventually became known as Fordism, this kind of factory methods. I just want to touch on source 4 very briefly. Here is a little source which makes reference to, it's from the Atlanta Constitution newspaper, it makes reference to how Americans would view the 1920s when the decade ends, hence why this is March 15th, 1929. I should say this was written before it becomes apparent that America is about to embark upon this horrendous depression that will last for a decade. But what you get here is just a little symbol of the 1920s being emphasised, and the automobile, right, the American car, is the symbol of the 1920s. And 3 lines down it does say in this Atlanta Constitution, Wednesday afternoon on Daytona Beach in Florida, a daring automobile driver seeking the absolutely inconsequential feat of racing a motor monster faster than the world record for such speed met a frightful death in his wrecked machine. and macerated a bystander. So this rather horrific story though sums up the age we live in. This is the age of speed. Things are getting quicker, people are becoming more daring, more adventurous. And with the benefits and the progress of things like the automobile, they were often as well negatives. At this point, obviously some of these negatives were not particularly well known, but they would become apparent as the days progressed and as the year of 1929 get closer and closer to the month of October when the Wall Street crash begins. So 1920s America is, I think, symbolised by things like radio and the automobile and other household appliances like the electrical refrigeration. Just very quickly I want to go back to the point I made at the start, which was credit. The ability for American families to consume is limited, right? You can only buy so many goods with your weekly wage. Therefore, and obviously you have to still pay things like rent and food and whatnot. So how did people afford a $700 car? Well, they can't just go and buy a car with savings that they have unless they're incredibly rich, and there were obviously some Americans who could do so, but for the ordinary Americans who were driving Henry Ford's Model T, this black car that you can see in the picture, for those Americans they had to use the Ford Weekly Purchase Plan. And here you see one of the examples of advertising where the man is looking out of the window jealously thinking how did his neighbour get the money to buy a car, and obviously not wishing to upset his wife and child, he eventually will realise and recognise that he can get this car on credit, and by getting a car on credit you can avoid having to delay your dreams. You can invest in your car now, and that's really what the article says. You fill in the coupon, you apply for credit, and you get your car, providing obviously you can pay for it on a weekly basis. Obviously most people were paid weekly back in the 1920s rather than monthly. Credit is something we still have in the world we live in today. Credit is a big part of the next story we're going to get to, which is the Great Depression. But it's kind of fundamental to capitalism, because unless you're going to seriously redistribute wealth so that people can afford one-off payments of large items like cars, unless you do that, then capitalism is not going to work without credit. So credit is fundamental, but something comes with credit, and the thing that comes with credit is debt. Now this is a remarkable little graph, right? Easy to understand. Consumer debt in the United States between 1921 and 1931, and you can see that consumer debt is already pretty high. In 1921 it was worth $3 billion. When we get to 1929, that point obviously where things start to change, consumer debt is at $7 billion. $7 billion. What if that debt is not repaid? What if people can no longer pay their debt back? What will happen to the American economy? What will happen to the companies, such as the Ford company, that are owed some of this money? Well, as I said, that's part of the next story, but it's worth putting out there at this point that the 1920s success is built on rather shaky foundations, because debt has to be paid back, and we'll see in the next story the problems when it cannot be paid back. Okay, let's move on. All of these factors are linked, right, I should say, hence why radio could have fallen into this category of social and cultural changes as well. But I want to move on to maybe the elements of 1920s America that I guess intrigue people interested in this decade, and that is the kind of cultural changes. Now there's a strong gender element here, and I think that's important. Women make great advances during the 1920s, and when I say women, I guess to some extent I'm meaning women sometimes from your more affluent backgrounds, either you're kind of socialites who are incredibly wealthy, but also kind of middle class women. And like everything else, the ideas and the behaviours do filter down from the top through the middle classes and will make their way down to the working classes. When we're talking here about the cultural and social changes, again we're talking about urban America, we're talking about Detroit and New York and Boston and Chicago. Most of them are talking about the rural south or the kind of plains in the Midwest. And we're also talking about California, right? California and San Francisco might be far removed from the rest of the country, but they are much more in line with New York than they are with other parts of the West. So we see technological changes again that impact on the lives of Americans. The introduction of the cinema, initially these were silent movies. These new kind of buildings in the heart of cities and in some towns were so important and so well loved by Americans. It was a social occasion to go to the cinema, and cinema attendance, as you can see in the top bullet point, increases dramatically during the 1920s, and women are much more likely to go to the cinema than men. Cinema was popular because of the glamour of Hollywood stars and the romantic themes and the very subtle sexual references that kind of come through. And to some extent, young people, women in particular, go to the cinema to maybe learn and to pick up kind of little tips as to what might be ways that they should behave in this new world of the 1920s. There's a character who is quite often depicted in these 1920 movies, the flapper, right, which is a kind of positive term of women. This is a confident female who has a distinct look, who may get divorced, who may use contraception, which is something else which emerges during the 1920s, family planning, under Margaret Sanger, as a kind of new idea, if you like, and it deeply upsets rural Christian conservative America. But for these young females living in cities in the 1920s, they are obviously attracted to the freedom that can come with contraception. Movies would also maybe give young females hints on how they should date. Dating becomes a thing in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, people didn't really date. Marriages weren't quite arranged, but you would kind of meet someone, you would court, and you would most likely be expected to carry on meeting that person until you get married. Whereas dating is different. Dating is irregular. Dating can be less serious than courting. Dating can lead to things like, to use the word in inverted commas of the historian Fash, can lead to petting. And petting was a new way of intimate relations between young females and young men. And this flapper character in the movies was someone who acted and behaved in these types of ways. In fact, I'm going to quote a little bit from the historian Fash right now, just to kind of give you an idea as to what this flapper character was like. I'm going to just speak, this is a first in history, talking about females bobbed hair, right? So this is, to quote Linda Fash, she said, bobbed hair, for example, which was the prevailing style for women on all university campuses, was enthusiastically defended on the grounds that it was a carefree and less troublesome way of looking after your hair. And this was all the rage in the pre-war period. You wanted to kind of manage your hair easily. After the war, but before this time, women had kind of long hair and it was kind of elaborate and so on. But this new bobbed hair, it facilitated indulgence in ad hoc and informal activities like sports, and made it easier for women to remain well groomed during an increasingly busy day on campus or at work. It was indeed liberating, as it emphasised the woman's more informal existence and behaviour. It allowed her to feel equal with men and unencumbered by a traditional symbol of her different roles. So there's a kind of feminist touch to the way that women would wear their hair, and in the same vein, cosmetics were also used in the 1920s much more frequently as well, and this is also a sign maybe of increasing female confidence. Take all of these kind of changes, which, as I said, the mass media, the movie stars are presenting, and you add to that the speakeasies and the ballrooms and the diners and the cinema, and working class people going to working class females are going to try and, where possible, replicate these styles, because the mundane experience of working in a factory or being stuck in the home, because working class women were not hanging about university campuses or working in offices. They were doing much more mundane work. This was a chance to free themselves from the monotony of everyday life, and that is why we do see the beginnings of the new female in the 1920s. I should say that in 1920 women are also given the vote, and that is because Woodrow Wilson believed that their war efforts allowed them to now have the same rights as men. I wouldn't want to give Wilson the credit for this. Women had been campaigning for the vote since the 19th century, and it was their continued fight for equality that eventually paid off in 1920. Very quickly, source 5 is a famous source from Lind and Lind, who conducted sociological research in a fictitious place, but it was a real place, but they called it Middletown, a study in American culture. This place was actually in Indiana, and what they found was that these new changes in kind of cultural and social life were a bit much for some families to kind of initially deal with. So I'm just going to very quickly read this. It says, the more sophisticated social life of today has brought with it another problem, much discussed by parents in Indiana: the apparently increasing relaxation of some of the traditional prohibitions upon the approaches of boys and girls to each other's persons. Here again, new inventions of the last 35 years have played a part. So one thing we should bear in mind is that the cinema and the automobile provide intimate spaces for young males and young females to kind of come together, which were never available to them prior to the 1920s, again unless they were kind of super rich. Here the reference is to the cinema. It says, in 1890 a well brought up boy and girl were commonly forbidden to sit together in the dark, but motion pictures and the automobile have lifted this taboo, and once lifted it is easy for the practice to become widely extended. So obviously intimate relationships are no longer chaperoned. You would have boys or females, again more so from the middle classes, picking up their partner or the person they're dating in their car. And that little reference I made at the start of bootleg gin and backseat sin. Backseat sin was obviously a reference to the backseat of an automobile car. So parents freaked out a little bit about these changes. Okay, let's move on away from cinema, away from cars, to a very quick section on demographics. I just want to touch on this briefly because I think it's important. Here you can see right at the end of the 1920s New York, and it's a remarkable sight in some respects. It still is a remarkable sight today when you see all of these skyscrapers, but for this picture to be taken in the 1920s is remarkable because it shows you the scale of progress in Manhattan, the scale of progress being obviously the construction of large buildings to save space. And New York was not alone. Other cities would also embark upon this desire to build upwards, and Chicago is an example, Boston is an example, Detroit is an example. The 1920s is, as I mentioned earlier, a period of contrast. So on the one hand you do have these demographic changes where cities and urban areas become more popular, but the only reason that can happen is because people are leaving rural areas. So obviously yes, you have natural birth in these cities and you have immigrants coming from other parts of the world, although I will come back to immigration in a moment because immigration is reduced during the 1920s. So cities do grow, but part of the reason for that is because of problems in rural areas. So 6 million farmers and their families come to the cities in the 1920s, and that's because of the deep-rooted agricultural problems in rural areas. Again, when we get to our discussion of the Great Depression, we will examine some of these agricultural problems. In fact, one of the main reasons as to why the Great Depression occurs is because of long-term structural problems within agriculture in the United States. One of the kind of key aspects of change is not just the kind of building of skyscrapers and the urban landscape looking rather impressive, but it's actually what goes on outside the actual inner city. It's the growth of the suburbs, and because of the automobile, people can now make their way from a location outside of the city to the city itself. And because for middle class Americans the city might be seen as being a place where the air wasn't particularly good, there's obviously some poverty and vice and crime and all these things, the idea of a area out with the city, but the city can still be reached for work and for shopping, became quite desirable. So we call these bedroom communities, and the automobile is fundamental for allowing for such a demographic change to occur within the United States. Suburban housing is all the rage in places like Long Island or in the areas just outside of the city or the central part of Los Angeles. I'll come back to the reservations about this in a moment. I just want to show you the pictures first. This here is an advertising poster for an area in California, in LA, Westwood Hills, which looks very desirable, and obviously cars are a major part of this place. And it says at the very bottom, America's most unique shopping centre, a village within a city. So this is a place where people can live and have really everything they need, even without going into downtown LA. The next picture I think is one of my favourite, which is Long Island. Now this picture of the 1920s, again, resembles to some extent the America of the 2020. It might even resemble some of the places that you will be familiar with in Scotland as well, where you now have areas which are sometimes referred to as kind of new build areas, which are just lots of houses, often detached houses that are kind of feel like they're in the middle of nowhere, but within maybe a 10-minute drive you can be close to civilization again. You can see cars on these roads, not that many cars, right, because you know, car production is still a fairly new thing at the start of 1920, but you can see cars on the roads. And the suburban lifestyle, although it can sometimes look a little bit bland and remote, was seen as just being more desirable for the middle classes. They could commute to and from work whilst their wife, the housewife, could look after kids, take their kids to school within this area. Now the reservations of this type of living, source 6, this comes from Harper's Weekly magazine 1926. It says, what is the need for thinking anyway when the newspapers, the movies, the radios, the motors, the automobiles will hand one the news and the thrills, absorb all time and leisure. There are few empty hours, solitary days in modern life, days when the mind can retreat within itself and assess its own resources. We are so busy buying things, going to all the places that everyone goes to and doing all the things that everyone does, that it's hardly necessary to think. It is easy to escape, therefore, by any of these mechanised diversions, that insistent pressing demon within each of us, which asks and insists upon an answer. What are you good for, and what are you making of your life? It's a very profound question, a kind of anti-modernist almost kind of claim. But it's not reactionary, it's kind of a little bit, again, like the world we live in today, where everything seems to be so fast, where there's not enough hours in a day to get things done, and we're always kind of the view that we have to be doing something. Obviously 1926 is long before social media existed, and that brings its own pressures in the modern world, but there's still pressures in 1926 of people being expected to behave and live in certain ways. And this author is asking, really, what are the benefits of living your life at such kind of breakneck speed? And again, this is part of this contrast of cultures, conflict of cultures that exists within the 1920s. That is not to say that the author of this is reactionary. There are reactionary elements in America, and that's what we're going to focus on now, the reaction to all of these social, cultural, political, economic changes. And I think the Klan symbolised this change, or this reaction to change, fairly well. So a little bit of this story is going to be on the Klan. But I should say that anti-immigration ideas, feelings, sentiments were strong without the Klan. The Klan, as you are aware, existed in the post-Civil War period, in the period we call Reconstruction era, and they are attacked by federal law under the presidency of Ulysses Grant. They kind of disappear, but they have a resurgence really from roughly 1915 onwards, when the American president, Woodrow Wilson, premieres at the White House The Birth of a Nation, this pro-Klan movie. We should always remember that about Wilson. He was not far from being pro-white supremacist. And the Klan make a comeback. They return. This is the second wave of the Klan in the 1920s. As this little poster here, this is the Klan crossing the Mason-Dixon line. This is the Klan on tour, going to the north and the Midwest, which they do successfully during the 20s. The Klan of the 1920s are one part of a much bigger story of kind of reactionary feeling within the United States. And what a lot of this reaction is against is actually not so much African Americans, although that always exists, right, and will never go away. And we've already seen that in the 1919, the violence in 1919 riots that took place across, race riots that took place across the United States. But the Klan are anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic, and therefore by being anti-Catholic are anti-immigrant more than anything else. And some of these ideas will then manifest themselves in the 1930s, when there's a bit of a fascist movement that develops in the United States. The anti-immigration sentiment impacts the American government. The government reacts under Harding, and then Coolidge will follow this. In the bottom here you can see the table of the changing patterns of immigration during the 1920s, and you will see that there is a reduction in immigration right at the very bottom. From 1921, 800,000 immigrants. By 1929 that falls to 279. Now, actually from Europe, immigration figures are reduced far greater than this. The reason why we still have 279,000 is because Canadians are still allowed to come into the country, as are Mexicans, unlike now, where there's this view that Mexicans are a threat to the American way of life. Mexicans, as is the case actually now, were still fundamental to the low-paid seasonal economy within the United States. So Mexicans were still allowed to come to the country. Really what the Immigration Act of 1921 was aiming to do was to deny access to the country to those from Eastern Europe. And those from Eastern Europe were most likely to be Catholics or Jews. When I say Eastern Europe for Catholics, I mean from Italy, from the south, east, and from Russia and other kind of countries in Eastern Europe where there may have been a large Jewish population. These are the groups that are denied entry, and you can see Eastern European figures drop to 4,500, and Southern Europe, which would include Italian Catholics, drops to 22,000 by 1929. So immigration is in serious decline, and that's a federal law passed in 1921 and then again in 1924. The next point really I want to make is this anti-immigrant feeling, if you like, was part of a kind of wider kind of pseudo-scientific attempt to question the desirability of having Native Americans, by that I mean white Americans, not Native Americans, having their kind of way of life contaminated by foreign cultures, foreign ideologies, foreign political views, and so say this kind of hatred or xenophobia is part of a kind of renewal of what we call the nativist assault. Nativism is an idea that can be traced back to the 1850s, when there were high levels of anti-Irish sentiment in the United States. It comes back in the 1920s, and this is where we kind of get this scientific element to it, right? I've put scientific also in inverted commas. Biology lecturer Edward Wigham toured the small towns of the Midwest in the 1920s with a sobering call to action. This is what he says. He says, an average of one child was born to every 3 graduates of the nation's leading women's colleges. And he is fearful that the American race is going to be depleted if white Americans don't have more kids, because, as he explains, in rather crude terms, one low-class, broad-backed, flat-chested, stout-legged, high-necked, stupid, ugly immigrant woman will in the same time produce 3. And then it sort of says, Wiggum's pathological nativism revealed deep currents of anxiety amongst the nation's dominant Anglo-Protestants. This is a WASP element within American society. Native-born Americans, so white Americans, wondered whether their beloved republic could absorb more immigrants. So the reason why these anti-immigration laws are passed is because some of these reactionary views start to emerge. The Klansmen of the 1920s, those who supported immigration restrictions, were fearful that this urban America, this America that we've spoke about so far, the America of the Prohibition era, of speakeasies and emancipation of women and Catholics coming to the country and enjoying drinking, and Italian gangsters promoting the sale of alcohol and selling alcohol. All of these things go against what traditional American culture should have been. That America should be small town, America should be Christian, Protestant, that America should be focused on the small businessman. A lot of these people who are attracted to the Klan and to these kind of anti-immigration kind of ideas are maybe the groups that have got some form of declining status within America. Blue collar workers, small clerks, small businessmen, some kind of small town professionals. Even in the 1920s, there is a desire amongst some Americans to deny the teaching of evolution within schools. Now I know actually weird that came back in more recent times as well, but there's a full-on kind of public trial in the 1920s. It's known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, which tried to ban evolution being taught by teachers in schools. So it's a period of great change in America, but with change comes reaction, and reaction is best summed up in the anti-immigration sentiment. One clear example of anti-immigration, something you're going to talk about in greater detail when you do a little task on this, is the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where 2 Italian anarchists, so type of people who were not seen as being real Americans, 2 Italian anarchists were accused of a murder, and there's a bit of a murder mystery story that I'm going to get you to examine. But it kind of, the Sacco and Vanzetti case I think sums up quite well the reactionary side of 1920s America. Okay, I want to conclude by summarising this guy here. This is the American president as the decade comes to a close. This is Herbert Hoover, and in 1929 Hoover basically tries to sum up the way that the decade is going to end. And for Hoover it was going to end, this is his inaugural address in 1929 after being elected president, and he thinks that things can only get better and things are already really good, is his view. So Hoover says, we have emerged from the losses of the Great War and the reconstruction following it with increased virility and strength. From the strength we have contributed to the recovery and progress of the world. Loans that were obviously given to European countries. What America has done has given renewed hope and courage to all who have faith in government by the people. In the large view, we have reached a higher degree of comfort and security than ever existed before in the history of the world, which is arguably true at that point, right, with the amount of consumer goods available to people. Through liberation from widespread poverty, well, that wasn't quite true, we have reached a higher degree of individual freedom than ever before. The devotion to and concern for our institutions are deep and sincere. We are steadily building a new race, a new civilization, great in its own attainments. The influence and high purposes of our nation are respected among the peoples of the world. We aspire to distinction in the world, but a distinction based upon confidence in our sense of justice as well as our accomplishments within our own borders and in our own lives. You could possibly feel sorry for Hoover because within 6 months, Wall Street has basically exploded. The crash is just that little spark that brings out all of the deep underlying problems that exist within the American economy, and we then see 10 years of depression and hardship. And Hoover is in charge of the first 4 years of this period that we call the Great Depression. He is not looked, back on in history with kind of fondness because he does not do enough to bring America out of the Depression. The next topic we're going to study, the Great Depression and the New Deal that addresses the Great Depression. That is the story of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is often seen, at least by those on the kind of liberal left, as being America's greatest president. But that is our next topic. For now, that is all. Thank you.